Okay, welcome to our Wednesday night class. We're going to focus on a special topic now. We are shortly going to begin what's referred to as the 3 weeks of mourning. This is the 3-week period between the 17th day of Tammuz, which is also a fast day, and the 9th day of Av, which is a fast day. And the fasts are focusing on the loss of the temple. The 9th of Av, which will come next month, the 9th of Av is the date on which there are many tragedies in Jewish history on that date, but it's also the date on which both of the Beit HaMikdash, the first Beis HaMikdash and the second Beis HaMikdash, the temples in Jerusalem, both were essentially destroyed on that day. That was the date when they were breached, and the temple was breached, and the destruction began. And it's been a tragic day in Jewish history for a long time. But I want to focus on the positive things. So the positive part is, if you want to have obviously mourning, the more you know someone, the closer you are to someone, the greater the loss. And it's just true with the Beis HaMikdash. If we stop and think and understand about what the Beis HaMikdash was and get a sense for it and a feel for it, then the fast days and the whole 3-week period between them of semi-mourning becomes more meaningful because you know what you're missing. I remember that when I was teaching in Sydney, Australia, so in America, in the Northern Hemisphere, these days, they're summer days, and everyone's off for camp or school and things like that, and everyone's out. You don't have any people in school. But in Australia, this is school days. Summer vacation is in January. And so we had class, and this topic we taught during the 3 weeks. We focused on this topic, and we really drilled down into the nitty-gritty of things. And my goal was that the kids, by the time we finished, they knew exactly where the bathrooms were, including everything else. I wanted to make it practical, right? So let's get started on this one. I'm going to add some graphics here to be working with, but let's start off before we get to the graphics. So where's the foundation of this? There's a commandment in the Torah that says, and you will make for me a sanctuary, and I will dwell within. During the 40 years that the Jews traveled in the desert, the Mishkan, the tabernacle, was a portable sanctuary. And every time they moved, they would take it all down and move and then build it all back up. And the moves themselves, most of those moves, they were there for quite some time. There were some moves where they were there for a few short months and then they moved again. Other times they were there for years, and they never knew when the next move would be. But the tabernacle was taken down and it was transferred. When we got to Israel and we settled in the Holy Land, so initially the sanctuary was built in the city of Gilgal. And then it was taken down and it was built in the city of Shiloh. It was still a temporary structure where the beams were made of wood and the covering was a canopy. It wasn't a permanent structure. When King David conquered Jerusalem, the Jews enjoyed a period of peace and prosperity, and David HaMelech wanted to build a house of God. He said, I have a palace, but what does God have? He needs a dwelling place down here in the lower world, in the lower realm. And so he wanted to build a home. So he spoke with the prophets, and the prophets told him at the time, King Samuel, Shmuel, and others, told him, it's not for you to build. You have blood on your hands, and this is a house of peace. And as much as the wars that you fought were wars for God, and they were commanded by God, and every battle was a sacrifice on the altar, nevertheless, this is a house of peace, and your son will build it. So what David did at that time, he did everything he could. He chose the site, and he gathered the materials, and he did everything he could short of actually building it. because his passion was to build the house of God. This was a very powerful, passionate thing for him. After his, so Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, he constructed the building. The first Beis HaMikdash stood in Jerusalem for 410 years. And then it was destroyed by the Babylonians when they came to conquer Jerusalem. When the Jews returned from the Babylonian exile, they built a second Beis HaMikdash, the second temple, and this structure lasted for 420 years before it was destroyed by the Romans on Tisha B'Av. So one of the commentaries from the prophets that God has given to us is, he also in the book of Ezekiel, he describes the third temple, the third and permanent temple. You'll notice a lot of things in Judaism come down to threes, right? So in the time of Mashiach, in the time of redemption, when all the Jews come home and we rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, so the prophet said that God tell the Jews to study this structure, and I will consider their study as if they actually built the Beis HaMikdash. There are many mitzvahs we can't do today because we don't have the temple, and so there's a limit to what we can do. Some mitzvahs we can't do. So if we study those mitzvahs, we're credited as if we actually had done them, which is why in the morning, during our morning prayers, there's a number of pieces that are talking about the sacrifices in the temple, and as we think about them and study them, it's as if we were doing them as well. It's also talked about fasting. When we give up the fat of our body, it is as if we're making a sacrifice on the altar. So the idea is that when we study Torah, when we study now specifically the building of the second temple and the details of the second temple, our study for this not only creates a passion and an interest for what we're missing, and a desire to get the third Beis HaMikdash, which hopefully will impel us to be involved in more and more Torah mitzvahs, but God takes it as if we were actually building the temple. Now, the temple we're going to be looking at is the second temple building, and it was a second temple as it was rebuilt by King Herod. King Herod, there's a whole story behind him. We won't go into tonight, but he ended up being a king over the Jewish people while they were under Roman rule, and he was a horrible tyrant. He was trying to establish his power, and part of the way that kings of days gone by would establish their power would be to destroy the opposition. And he persecuted the Jewish people, and he killed many of the sages of Israel at the time. What would we compare that to today? As if someone came and killed everybody in the Supreme Court and the Senate and slaughtered them all. Now what do you do?
No loss.
Pardon? So Herod was
now, Jeff.
the king of Judah. He was again under the Roman authorities. After he had all but one of the sages slain, then he expressed his regret. He realized the disaster he'd caused and what he had done, and he had true remorse. We say true remorse because we see the results of his remorse. It really haunted him. And he went to the last scholar and he said, how can I atone for my deeds? And Baba Ben Buta replied, the one who extinguished the light of the world, which is the sages, the light of the Torah, the one who extinguished the light of the world now has to busy himself with the light of the world, which is the temple, the Beis HaMikdash. And initially Herod was like, Rome won't let me do it. And Baba Ben Buta said, send a messenger to Rome to present your request. His journey will take a while. In the meantime, get started. Get it rolling. Herod followed Ben Buta's advice. The messenger finally returned from Rome with the following. If you have not begun the work, don't. If, however, the building is already in the process of renovation, we won't stop you. So now he had the begrudging permission to go ahead. Herod was a master builder. A master builder. Now, if any of you have been to see some of the ancient ruins in Europe or in Israel, it blows one's mind to see the things that they were able to create. Aqueducts running to Israel all the way from Europe, etc. It's amazing. As a 9-year-old, we were traveling through France, and there's one massive bridge that goes over a huge valley. I can't remember the name at the time, but we got to walk across it. We didn't have safety rules back then. We literally walked across the top of this aqueduct that was thousands of feet in the air. My mother had a death grip on both of her kids. I have a picture of that, right? So Herod was a master builder, and he put a lot of his energies into this. And our sages relate that as a divine sign of favor, it only rained at night. The entire time the second Beis Hamikdash was being renovated, it only rained at night. So nothing should stop the workers from continuing their work. When the building was completed, our sages that were left, they declared, whoever has not seen the Beis Hamikdash built by Herod has never seen a truly beautiful edifice. It was, and we're going to study it tonight. It was. We won't see the glitter part of it tonight, but the structural part of it and the ins and out of it we'll look at. But it was absolutely amazing, amazing structure. So let's talk a little bit about this. Let me pull up the pictures first. Share screen. Okay. Spotlight. There we go. All right. So the Beis Hamikdash stood majestically on the top of Har HaMoriah, the mountain of Moriah. When David HaMelech was looking into where should he build the temple, right? Where would be a good place to build a temple? So he looked into Torah. And Har HaMoriah, this place, is the primordial stone of creation began here. This is where Abraham brought his son Isaac to slaughter. This is where Jacob had his dream of the ladder going up into heaven. This is even previous to that, the top place where Noah brought his sacrifices. Actually, not Noah. Cain and Hevel brought their first sacrifices. This place has been a holy place since the foundation of creation. And so David was able to find and locate where this place was and choose this place to be the one that we're going to build the temple on. Throughout the long history, these walls have been breached and demolished by many invading armies who fought for control of Jerusalem. Fascinatingly enough, however, many of the original stones are still there in the lower layers where they had been laid by the ancient builders of the second Beis Hamikdash. I'm going to take a quick note here. This is the mountain and the structure. We'll get into a little bit later. And the city of David, Jerusalem, is down here. This is the temple courtyard, the temple ground itself. This building here is the glory of the temple. On our map over here, that's the same piece as this one. What's fascinating is when you go to visit Israel today and you go to the Western Wall, that's the exterior wall here. Why is that such a holy place? Well, as we'll look at it later, that place is right behind the Holy of Holies where the Ark of the Covenant stood. It is the closest place on the Temple Mount to where the Ark of the Covenant stood. So the most widely used entrance to the Har HaBayis, the Temple Mount, was on the southern side, down here, the southern side. David built his capital in Jerusalem on the southern slope of the mountain. And part of the reason was because down here we have the well of Shaloach, the Shaloach well. It was a natural spring at the bottom of the mountain, and it fed most of Jerusalem with its supply of water. The southern slope of the mountain actually rises very gently up the hill, but the eastern and the western sides of the mountain of Moriah, Har Moriah, is much less accessible, very sharp. On the north side is also more of a gentle sloping area. And in fact, most of the conquests of Jerusalem, if not all, they came through the north side. Nebuchadnezzar of Babel, Titus of Rome, the Crusaders, they all came through the northern side. By the way, so did the Israeli forces in the 6-day war. They were able to come across from the top of the north and come back into the city of David, Jerusalem, and they conquered the western wall. If you've ever seen the recordings, it's a very touching, emotional moment. But you can hear on the battalion radio, the house is in our hands. We have it, the house is in our hands again. So the city of David, the population was down here. So and these walls were difficult to go to. So the vast majority of the people coming to visit the temple would come through the south, and they would go through the gates of Huldah, which we'll talk about soon, but they would come through these gates, and these gates would go into underground tunnels that would wind back and forth as they slowly, instead of going up the mountain, they would slowly work their way up the mountain. The walls inside the tunnels were tiled, and they were tiled in such a way that it gave an effect of an ocean, of traveling underwater, like during the times we traveled in the Red Sea. And then they would come out in the middle of the temple courtyard. And we'll get back to that in a little bit later, but they come up in the temple courtyard. The gates of Huldah were called the gates of Huldah because there was a prophetess. Her name was Huldah. And in order to be available to her people who came for questions, she positioned herself by the gates of there to be available. Rather than people seeking advice having to come find her in an office or someplace, she made her place here where they would be going anyway. And so the gates were called the gates of Huldah because of her. I want to skip to this picture here. So if we look just at the top of the mountain, so this area right here, if we look at the mountain top, this is the same thing over here. Again, the north side, the south side, east and west. The gates of Huldah would wind through here and come out in the middle of the courtyard. Interestingly enough, if you look at the courtyard, you'll see that the temple is not built centrally. The largest distance is from the south wall to the Beis Hamikdash. Then the gate, the space in between the eastern wall and the temple. Back here and the western area was the smallest area, the shortest distance between the outer walls and the temple itself. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. Let's go around the side. So the gates, so if we're talking about the Temple Mount itself, so most people came from the south. This was the gates of Huldah. There was also a Shushan gate. Now, why is it called the Shushan gate? Because when you remember the story of Purim and all the stories there, but during the Persian rule, the second temple was rebuilt under King Cyrus, who was the son of Esther. He became the king of Persia, and he said, "The Lord God of heaven has given me all of the kingdoms of the earth, and he's charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem. Let those of his people, may God be with them, go up to Jerusalem and build the house of the Lord God of Israel." Now, they're still a conquering empire, the Persians. And so you give us the right to build our temple, you get a little bit too much self-confidence, and there could be a whole rebellion on their hands again. So the one thing that they did is that they insisted that on the eastern side, facing the rising sun, would be the Shushan gate with a large carving of the seal of the city of Shushan, which the seal of Shushan was the picture of a rose. So the capital of Persia is engraved with a rose, so to speak, on the eastern gate, very prominently, as a reminder that we're still under the domain of the Persian Empire. When one stands by the Shushan gate, you are directly in line to the Holy of Holies. Direct in line to the Holy of Holies. And there's a special activity. The special activity here, there's hang on a second, let me have my thoughts here. On Yom Kippur, there's a sacrifice. 2 goats. 2 goats are taken on Yom Kippur, and one goes Azazel, is to be cast off the cliffs. So what happens? There's a gate, the Shushan gate. Now remember, this is the eastern side, so there's a big valley there, right? It's the Kidron Valley. So the gate from there could see straight across to the Mount of Olives. And that's where he would go towards to kill the goat. But also the Para Aduma. The Para Aduma is the red heifer. There's a commandment that to be purified from our impurities, and these are spiritual things, not physical, but to be spiritually cleansed of our impurities. The ashes of the red heifer have to be sprinkled on the person who has been involved in a burial or some other thing involved with death. And so the ashes of the red heifer. So how did you get that? A red heifer, a paraduma, was taken from the Beis HaMikdash to the Shushan gate, across the, let me see, I got a picture here. Across the valley. No, don't have that one. So through the Kidron gate, across the valley, straight to Har HaZeisim, the Mount of Olives. And before the slaughtering of the Para Aduma, the person slaughtering the Para Aduma has to look to the Beis HaMikdash and has to see straight to the Holy of Holies, the curtain of the Holy of Holies. A direct line. So from here, he has to be able to see across the valley, through the Shushan gate. I'm going to go over this diagram here. Through the Shushan gate, through the entrance to the temple structure itself, through the gates of Nicanor, past the side of the ramp itself, through the entrance hall, into the Kodesh area, so you can see the curtain of the Holy of Holies. And that was part of what he has to do in the Temple Mount. Interesting thing. Let's skip it for just a second. Let's look at the levels, right? The pavilion, you come up the gates of Huldah, you come into the pavilion, that's here. If you go up the elevation, Ezras Nashim, to the court of the women area, that would be about here. You go up more steps into the Ezras Yisrael, the court of the courtyard of the Israelites. A few more steps into the inner courtyard where the shechita, the actual slaughtering, is done. Then up the steps of the ulam, the temple, the big temple structure itself, we'll call it the ulam, and there would be the date. So this had to be a straight line of sight all the way across the Kidron Valley. A fascinating little piece of tidbit there. Okay, let's come back to here. So we talked about the Shushan gate. So we talked about the Shushan gate here. And then coming to the side is the Tadi gate. The Tadi gate was very rarely used, but it had a very specific person. If someone was on the Temple Mount, whether it's visitors or Kohanim themselves who are working on the Temple Mount, or Levium, if something should happen that they become Tomei, impure, for whatever reason it would be, they need to leave. They cannot be impure on the Temple Mount. They need to leave. And they have to leave as quickly as possible. Well, someone who's moving quickly through the temple might be suspect of having become impure. So it was through this back gate that he would depart. The Kohanim or anyone who became Tomei would leave quietly, discreetly through the Tadi gate, so no one would no one would be the wiser of their current status of impurity. And then we have the Kafernas gate, the garden gate on the far west side, right behind the garden. It's called the garden gate because right behind here, there was a large garden that grew some of the things that were used in the temple for spices and things like that, the incense spices. Some of that stuff was grown right through the Kafernas gate, the gate. If someone found out that they are a mourner, I found out this morning that a dear friend of mine lost his father today, early this morning. So you never know when you're going to hear. And if you are now, he's now a mourner. And a person who's mourning, it's not a place to be at the Beis HaMikdash. They need to leave. They should leave the Beis HaMikdash. And the way they leave is they go the long way around. They go the long way around. And that gives everyone a chance to say that, yes, they're leaving, but it gives everyone a chance to pay their respects and give their condolences on the way out. It's interesting, by the way, on the Temple Mount itself, we're going to see fascinating things, but underneath the Temple Mount is equally fascinating. Because of the laws of purity and impurity, there were many caverns and tunnels and arches that supported the structure to prevent, so that if someone died down below, the impurity would not go onto the Temple Mount because of the way it was built with all of these arches and tunnels. So a fascinating structure down below. We talked about coming up to the Beis HaMikdash. So you would come up through usually from the city of David. You would go through the gates of Huldah and come out through the tunnel entrances from the gates of Huldah. And at that point, at the top of the tunnel, you're in a very large pavilion on the southern side of the Temple Mount. And it's covered, much of this is covered, not all, but much of this is covered by a roof and these awesome pillars that held it all up. But the roof protected the visitors from the rain, the winter rains, and from the scorching summer, but it was still open enough that the breezes could come through. And these ornate pillars that supported the roof itself. In fact, some of those pillars were so wide, it took a couple of people. If you want to wrap your hand around a pillar, it could take a few people to be able to hold hands to wrap themselves around the pillars. They were so big. So if we come from the gates here of Huldah and we work our way around, we're going to be looking at the temple structure itself. That's what we want to look at now. So we're going to look at it from the eastern side. So here's the Shushan gate. There is a short fence about knee high, just about knee high, that goes around the entire structure. And wherever there's a door, there's an entrance there as well. But around that structure of the Soreg, at each entrance, there was a sign reminding everyone that this area is holy and not to go in there if they have any type of impurity. And it lists some of the types of impurities as a reminder. Don't go here if you shouldn't be here. So that's the Soreg that goes around the entire temple. We go past the soreg into the chayil, which is this area around of the courtyard, and up the steps. That's the first set of steps. The second set of steps, I guess, coming in. And there's a courtyard here, which is called Ezras Nashim, the women's courtyard. Before we get to the Ezras Nashim, I want you to take note of the Sanhedrin Katana and the Sanhedrin Katana here. These were small courts. There was a small building where a small court would be in session, and people who had challenges, they were able to be brought to the court here. Part of the reason that the courts, these higher courts, are held in the Temple Mount is a reminder that the decisions the courts are making are based on God's holy Torah. This is not human logic. It is based on God's holy Torah and decrees. And so there's a Sanhedrin Katana here. And if we went from this court to a Sanhedrin Katana inside the Temple Mount, and then we'll find out that the larger court was back here with the 72 sages there. Going back to a couple of notes here, there was a question about Cyrus being Jewish. So yes, Cyrus, the ruler of Persia, was the son of Queen Esther, and obviously he was raised by the kings in the king's palace. He was raised to be a Persian, but obviously the fact that his mother is Jewish made him Jewish. But that was the focal point there. The pictures that I'm showing you are done. They were created for a children's book called Beyond the Wall, a tour of the Beis Hamikdash. And the authors are a couple, a rabbi and his wife, of Eliyahu and Malka Tauger. They are very greatly known mechanchim, educators. And this is what they put together based on the literatures we see from the Mishnah and from the Talmud. The Talmud goes into greater length about the details, but these are from them. So let's go in through. So we see that kind of the smaller head court, the next higher court, and then the highest court of the land, the 71 sages, they met here. If we're looking at levels of kedusha, levels of holiness, levels of sanctity, you're going through different steps. Obviously, the entire Temple Mount is holier than the city of Jerusalem, which is the holiest city in the world. And then you go up on the mountain, and in the mountaintop, here's the Har HaBayis, here's the temple itself. Within the temple itself, we'll find that the first courtyard, which is called the Ezras Nashim, was the higher level of sanctity. But higher still was the area, the inner courtyard, where the shechita, the sacrifices were done, and the large altar was built here, and all the sacrifices were done in this courtyard. You go up another set of steps, and we'll look into this one, and you actually have the temple building itself. The temple building is obviously at a higher level of kedusha. There's three parts of that temple, and we'll look at some of the pictures later. There's the ulam, which is this structure, an entrance area. Then there'll be the kodesh, the holy, and the back part will be the kodesh HaKadosh, and the holy of holies, where the ark would sit. So there are degrees of sanctity on each of the different levels. As we come into the Sanhedrin Katana, we have 4 chambers on the sides. And now remember that this is the place where the Jewish people come to commune with God, to connect with God. There are miracles happening here all day, every day, for the entire time it existed. There were more miracles during the first temple era. The second temple, there were less, but daily miracles. Like, for example, no flies. It's a shecht house, it's a slaughterhouse, and there were no flies, none. So the miracles that were just part of daily living in the temple. So the wood chamber, all the sacrifices were burned. The incense was burned, the the animal sacrifices that were burnt up on the altar. There's a lot of wood that goes into this. The wood has to be checked. The wood has to be, pardon the expression, but it's kosher. It has to be kosher wood. What does that mean? No bugs. Only the best of the wood can be used for the temple for the sacrifices to God. And so the wood chamber in the northeast corner of the Ezra's Nashim, that wood chamber was where they checked all the wood. Now, the wood was brought up, obviously, through Jerusalem, up through the gates of Huldah, and it was brought through the gates, gate of firewood. This gate is the gate that the wood was brought into, and was brought into Temple Mount, and they brought it here for checking to make sure that there was no worms. The Mitzrayim chamber is Mitzrayim is someone who became defiled because of Lashon Hara. English, the English translation is oftentimes used a leper. The modern day concept of leprosy is not at all what a Metzora was. The disease was a spiritual disease that broke out as lesions on the body or on the clothing or on the house. But someone who had been through this had to bring special sacrifices to overcome their impurity. And so they would come to this chamber, and there in this chamber, they would go through their purification processes, and including preparing their sacrifices and bringing their sacrifices for slaughter. On the southwest area was the oil chamber. There's a part of the sacrifices included the animal kingdom, the vegetable kingdom, and the inanimate aspect was the temple itself. One of the reasons that the temple built in Jerusalem was holier than the tabernacle that traveled in the desert is because it went to a lower level. When we talk about the 4 degrees of creation, there's the inanimate, stone, rock, that kind of, the vegetation level, the animal level, and then the medabrim, the speaking one, mankind. What's interesting in Kabbalah talks about the highest falls the lowest, meaning that in a spiritual way, the greatest sparks are in the lowest of creation. The inanimate contains some of the highest sparks. How do those things get elevated? By the way we use them. The animal kingdom, when the animals are used where they're eaten and a blessing is made on them, that elevates them. If they're used for as a sacrifice, that elevates them. If they're used for holy work, that elevates them. Then the next level, of course, is medabrim, is the people and how we behave ourselves. And it's our capacity to change all the lower levels. It's our job to bring them up. The tabernacle in the desert was made of wood and metal and tapestry. It had the animal kingdom and it had the vegetative kingdom. It had some gold lining to it, but the structure itself, the foundational structure, was made of wood and metal. Here, the Beis HaMikdash, it was made of stone. And that represents the ability to elevate the lowest level to the highest. So the temple was built of stone. And in the temple, there are animal sacrifices. With the animal sacrifices are brought wine libations and as well as breads. There were breads that were made, and the breads were made with flour and water, sometimes flour and oil. The oil that was used was prepared here. The menorah that sat in the holy area of the temple was prepared here in the oil chamber for the fine oils, and this was in this area. The Nazirite chamber was the area for a Nazir, someone who had taken a vow of abstinence, and they would take a vow for a 30-day period, a 90-day period, whatever period they chose. They took a vow. They didn't cut their hair. They didn't touch any grape products, not grapes themselves, or wine, or juice, or the skins of the grapes. They didn't even go into an orchard. And they sanctified themselves by refraining from part of the world. Well, that's a good thing. If we're out of control, sometimes you need to stop, take a break, and get control again. The Nazir would do that, but at the end of his period, he wants to come to thank God for the help of the purification process. But also there's a sin offering he has to bring. What's the sin offering? He's trying to be holier, right? The sin offering is that, yes, he became holier. Yes, he did good things, but in the meantime, he didn't fulfill the mission. The mission is to sanctify the world. And he refused to participate in the sanctification of the grape products. So again, he comes to the Nazirite chamber. They prepare for their sacrifices there. They've grown their hair long. The hair gets shaved off. That becomes a part of that which is burned in the sacrifice. And this all happens in the Nazirite chamber. Let's take a little walk along the side here. So we go to the Ezras Nashim. We go up the steps. Actually, let's not go up the steps yet. See the two doors on the side? Those two doors led into the chambers where the Levium, the Levites, kept their instruments. The Levites, the instruments of the Levium were kept there. Their job is to bring the spiritual power of music to the temple. They would take their musical instruments and they would come out on these steps. This is the steps, and they would they would play on the steps there. They would sing that, they make their music, and they would sing. They would sing their songs here. And this was the area where the Levium would come to. And here is one tall gate. It's called the Nicanor gate, the gate of Nicanor, and two side gates. Nicanor's gate was the big entrance hallway, and it was tall enough. This entrance had to be tall enough. Remember, the guy who sacrifices the paradama on Har Hazeisim, the red heifer on the Mount of Olives, has to be able to see clear all the way through to the temple itself. So the gates of Nicanor had to be clear enough that his vision would go through the gates here, all the way to the gate here. So this is a very tall gate. It's called the gates of Nicanor for a very fascinating reason. During the time of Herod's temple, and they were doing renovations, Nicanor was a gentleman, a very, very wealthy gentleman, and he decided that he wanted to replace the wooden gates at this point of the temple with bronze. He wanted to build it with bronze, and therefore he hired the very best of the let me read the story here. The Jews who built the second temple were very poor. Years passed, the Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael became more established and secure. A wealthy man named Nicanor decided to donate new bronze gates to replace the old wooden ones. He went to Egypt to hire the finest bronze workers in the world. And the master craftsmen oversaw the fashion of these two artistically engraved huge gates. Now, these bronze gates, you can imagine bringing them back from Egypt. They came by sea. So they left Egyptian port and they came by sea. While they were out at sea, a violent storm broke out, and waves and rain and thrashing and everything. And they needed to lighten the load on the ship. And the sailors grabbed the gate of Nicanor, one of the two gates, and they tossed it over. And Nicanor was beside himself, and it didn't stop the problems. And so shortly thereafter, they went for the second gate, and at that point he couldn't take it. He physically threw himself on top of the gate and said, "If you're throwing it in, throw it in with me." And so they stopped, and at that moment the seas calmed and everything was quiet, and they continued their journey. in one sense, you can imagine the relief of Nicanor that he saved one of the gates, but it bothered him the whole way home. Why didn't he do that? Why did he do that for the first gates? Why didn't he throw himself in to save the first gate itself? And it troubled him the whole way home. And imagine their amazement when they get to the dock at Acre, and there, right underneath the hull, comes floating the first door. So this miracle of Nicanor's gates was such a phenomenal event. And when it came time to upgrade some of the things in the temple to gold in the wealthier time, because of this miracle, they never changed the gates of Nicanor. They never replaced them with gold. Everything else was getting gold, but the miracle was so amazing that they left the golds, the bronze doors here from Nicanor. Notice here that one enters through Nicanor's gate. One departs this area from the side gates, an entrance and exits. And part of the reason is you never turn your back on the temple. You never turn your back on the Holy of Holies. So they would walk in facing the Holy of Holies. They would back out on the side gates, and the safety and on the traffic pattern was kept that way. Let's go back to the outside categories here. So this first part of the structure here was called the House of Avnitas. Let's see if we can come over to this one here. So this gate here was called the House of Avtinas, and so below it is the water gate. Above it is the House of Avtinas. There was a very special family that lived in that. This is where they prepared the incense offerings, and they had a very special blend of exactly how to make the incense that was used in the temple altar, and so that was prepared up here. When different sacrifices have different levels of holiness, and when someone has a herd of and it has firstborn of a cow, the firstborn of any animal, of cows and calves and goats, have to be brought to as sacrifices. Those would be brought through the gate, the gate here. It showed their level of sanctity. The firewood comes through this gate. This was called the upper gate. I'm trying to remember what that was special for. Let's see if there's a note here. The natural incline of the mountain made this the highest point of the Temple Mount. That was why it's called the upper gate. We turn back through here along the western wall. This is the gate of Yochaniah, the name that evokes the memories. There were several phases in the Babylonian conquest of Yerushalayim that ultimately result in the destruction of the first temple. When the Babylonians first defeated the Jews, they exiled King Yochaniah and members of the royal court. But the king requested permission to pray in the Beis Hamikdash before being taken into exile, and he left through this gate. So it's called the Gate of Yochaniah because of him. This is actually a two-story structure. The upper story was known as the Chamber of the Spark. God commanded that the fire on the altar be kept continually burning. Were it to be extinguished, it would be immediately relit from the flames of a constant fire that was burning here. And that is why oftentimes we talk about, in many times in a shul, at the top of above the Aron Kodesh, there'll be a ner tamid, an internal light. The eternal light in the temple, in a synagogue, is in commemoration of the idea that there was always a fire burning on the altar, and there was always a backup flame burning here. Yes, there's a comment here that when you get called up to the Torah in a synagogue, you get called up to the bima, and when you're done, when you leave the bima, you do not turn your back on the Aron Kodesh. You do not turn your back on the ark. And again, that's reminiscent of always facing the ark. Beyond this gate is the gate of sacrifices. As mentioned above, the sacrifices were constantly, there were different levels, and the Kodesh Kadoshim, the Holy of Holies, would be slaughtered only in this northern section of the temple. That where the slaughter would be going. These sacrifices were brought through this gate. And then over here we have what's called the women's gate. This is where they would bring their sacrifices. Didn't have to compete with in the crowd mashing with the guys. And then the final gate is the chamber of the hearth. This was a large domed building, and you'll notice that unlike most of them, this building, half of it is inside the wall and half of it is outside the wall. The sanctity of the temple itself had to be kept on this side. It was more lenient on the northern side of the room, which only needed to have the sanctity of the temple courtyard. There were many restrictions that applied to these sacred areas, and there were wooden marking posts inside this building. On both sides of the building, there were marking posts on both sides, and that would be able to distinguish which side of the room you're on, and you'll be able to know what level of sanctity you have to be maintaining here. It's called the chamber of the hearth because there's a large fire burning in the center of this room. Think about the Kohanim. The Kohanim are walking around the base of Mikdash, and these are stone floors, right? And it's cold. The stone floors are cold. So practically speaking, the chamber of the hearth has a constant fire going, so Kohanim can go in here and warm up, and so to speak, put their feet to the fire, warm up a bit, right? So throughout the day, they would come back for warm up. Their garments were also made of light fabrics, and so the Kohanim who were serving in the temple, and this was their work change, they would actually sleep here on the stone floors, and obviously the stone would be cold, so the fire was kept burning. And therefore, because the fire was kept burning, the stone slabs on which they slept were positioned along rows in this building and kept warm. We have a picture of here. All right, so within the chamber of the hearth, again, we have 4 more rooms inside the chamber of the hearth. The chamber of the goats that were being prepared for sacrifices, the chamber of the baker of the showbread. This is where they would actually take the grain and mix it with the flour and oil and prepare the breads to be brought in. Chamber of the tokens, just a practical thing. The tokens that were used for organizing things in the base of Mikdash, whose turn it is, which Kohen is going to get to do which activity, right? So it's a matter of taking turns. And then the chamber of the stairway, which leads back down to some of the underground storage rooms and underground workshops there underneath the Temple Mount. Regarding the chamber of the showbread, the art of making these special bread sacrifices was done by a family. It was kept in the family, like a baker's secret. Right? So the baker's secret was kept in the Garmu family. When they were asked to disclose the secret of their art, they refused. Now the sages were displeased by their refusal, dismissed them, hired professional bakers from Alexandria, Egypt, to take their place. But the quality of the bread was not comparable. So the sages asked the original bakers return to their jobs, but they asked them, why won't you share your knowledge with others? How to make this bread? And they said, it has been a family tradition not to disclose the secret of this art with anyone. Our ancestors foresaw the Beis HaMikdash would be destroyed, and they did not want someone who was unworthy to learn this art and use the special art of these special breads to be used to be sold on market. It was only for use in the temple, and they kept it. They went to the grave with their secrets. The chamber of the tokens also, when you were bringing wine or meal offerings, you could purchase them through here, but you didn't use money, and so you was purchasing the tickets, and then the tokens were exchanged. Okay. We saw here this side, the northern side we talked about already. We went through that tour. So remember we talked about what the gates of Nicanor are, right? So right inside, let me get an overview. Let's see if we get an overview here. Let's see. Ah, okay. This was the entrance gate. We had the Ezras Nashim, the women's courtyard. We had the chambers on the side. We continued on up the steps. The chamber of song was on the side. And we had the gates of Nicanor here. The chamber of Chavitin and the chamber of Pinchas. Here we go. Next to the gates, next to Nicanor's gates. The chamber of Chavitin. The Chavitin was a sacrifice, an offering that was brought every day by the Kohen Gadol to remind him of his special role in presenting the Jewish people before God. So the Kohen Gadol, before he comes to do sacrifices, for everybody else, he has to do his own. He has to do his own personal reflection about the responsibilities of his role and bring his own personal sacrifice, and then he could bring the others. In the northeastern corner of the courtyard is the chamber of the hewn stone. Chamber site here. This chamber derived its name from the hewn marble seats on which the 71 judges, members of Sanhedrin of the Jewish people, the marble seats were made here. This chamber, like the chamber of the hearth, also extended past the central line. So on this side of the chamber of the hewn stone is where they could sit. No one was allowed to sit in the temple itself except the king of Israel, and anyone else, whether it's the judges or anyone else, they're not allowed to sit. It's a holy place. But on the outside part of these chambers, there one could sit. The leaders of the Sanhedrin, the high court, the Nasi, the prince of Israel, his assistant, the Av Bezdin, the head of the court, they were seated in the center, and around them sat 3 concentric semicircles, rows of 23 judges, and those rows of 33, they were all facing one direction. Then there was the chamber of the well. That provided water for all the needs of the Beis Hamikdash, including the chamber of the Parhedron. The chamber of the Parhedron. Well, before we get there, so this chamber of the well is also where the Kohen Gadol would stay for the 7 days before Yom Kippur. Before Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol had to come and be isolated and prepare himself, and the sages would be there to watch over him and to remind him and to teach him every day, so that he would know when Yom Kippur comes how to do the proper service. They would prepare him for this, and he had to stay here on the temple those 7 days. But you can't sit, you can't sleep there. So on the outside the center line here, on the northern side of the chamber, was considered outside the walls, and that's where the Kohen Gadol would prepare. On the inside of the courtyard, we have 3 more chambers here. There's a chamber of salt, where salt was kept and prepared for the sacrifices. All the meat sacrifice had to come with salt. The Torah teaches us, place salt on all your sacrifices. It's a reminder of when God split the heavens and earth, when God created the waters above and the waters below, the heavenly waters and lower waters, the lower waters, so to speak, the spiritual entity of the lower waters, the oceans, complain because they got down below. They don't get to stay up on high. And God said that my people will be reminded of you at every sacrifice. You'll be a part of every sacrifice. So every sacrifice has to also come with salt, which, by the way, is also why we dip our bread in salt, as a reminder of this commitment that God had made regarding the heavens above and the waters below, that they should all be remembered in that split. There's more Kabbalah on that, but we're not going to go into that tonight because we're already going overtime. So now we go up to the washing chamber. The washing chamber, that's where right. And the chamber of, first is the chamber of hides. Okay, so the chamber of hides is where the hides of the animals that were used for sacrifice, this is where those hides get processed. And on top of the chamber of hides, there's also a mikveh. And that's where the Kohen Gadol would go to. When we talk about the Yom Kippur service, and the Kohen goes and he immerses himself and he dries himself, etc., back and forth each time he's going in and out. So this is where that happens. The Yom Kippur mikveh service is right here in the chamber of hides on the second floor. The washing chamber is where all the guts get washed out from all the animal sacrifices that are done. That all has to be cleaned out before going to the up on the Temple Mount, and that's all in this area. We talked about the Ezras Nashim, the women's courtyard, the Israelite courtyard here, and then there's a priestly courtyard. There's steps going between the women's courtyard and the Israelite courtyard, separating those. And then there's another set of steps between the Israelite courtyard and the priestly courtyard. These steps here were called the Duchan. The Duchan is where the Kohanim would bless the people. You've seen during our during our high holiday services, and on Passover and on Sukkot, the Kohanim go in front of the congregation, and they go under a talus and they bless the people. That tune is actually one of the only tunes we have left from the temple era. But that was the tune the Kohanim would use here on the Duchan, on these steps, as they blessed the Jewish people. And they blessed the Jewish people in the Beis Hamikdash regularly, not just on holidays. Well, I'm watching our time here. I want to finish our tour. There's a large altar here. This is not the golden altar. This is the copper altar. The copper altar was filled with earth every time they moved. So this would be the altar that they built, the tabernacle they traveled in the desert with, but also here at the permanent structure. It's the top is connected with the earth itself at the bottom. There's a ramp that goes up. There's a lot to study about this structure in and of itself. There's ramps on the side that go around the outside of it, and there's sacrifices that are required there. There are certain things that are done on the ramp itself during the sacrifices. There are a couple of holes, almost like nostril holes, over on the corner where the wine is poured, and all of these things that happen up on the altar, that's right here. To the north of the altar, there were rings along the temple floor that were used to tie the rope that was harnessing the animals that were bought for slaughter. Then there were tables for the slaughter and pillars where the meat was hung, so that it could be the skin could be removed and the entrails could be taken out and the sacrifices could be prepared. That's all here. This is a shaft house. This is a slaughterhouse right here. On the other side over here is the washing basin. This was a large copper water basin, fascinating structure. the water basin was lowered into the ground at night. There's a river that runs, there's a small river that runs through the entire understructure of the Beis Hamikdash. The basin was lowered down to the river, water was brought up, and the Kohanim washed their hands and feet before their service from this basin. You can imagine what this area of the temple looked like. It's a slaughterhouse. It's a mess. Blood and guts, right? It's a mess. How'd they clean that? So the river that ran underneath, was blocked, was dammed. The water would back up into the Temple Mount itself. The Kohanim would run around with mops all over the temple grounds. And then the dam would be opened and everything would drain out. And again, moving all the water and all the stuff is being drained out through that same central area. Anyone who's been to Israel, you'll see a lot of people, they have a unique way of washing the floors in Israel, which is the same kind of thing. They pour water all over it, they run around with that, and then they'll use a squeegee to get it all out, and that cleans the floors. But we see it right here. Let's look at the Holy of Holies. There were steps up into the Holy of Holies again, and a huge entrance hall, a magnificent entrance hall. Hanging around them was golden chains that were designed like grapevines with leaves and grapes and everything, and they covered the entrance hall here. There was a candelabra, chandelier in the center here that, remember, the sun rises in the east, right? So services started just as the light hit, as the sunrise, the light would hit the chandelier here. That was the code that it's time to go. All the services begin. Inside, we have the Kodesh, the sanctified area of the Beis Hamikdash. And here you have the golden altar, which is a very small altar, but it was a golden altar that was used for the sacrifice of besamim, of spices. To the north of here, we have the table of the showbread. This is where the breads were brought. The breads were brought in here. They were left for the week, and then they were taken out and new ones replaced. The bread was then eaten by the Kohanim. It was shared amongst the Kohanim. Fascinatingly enough, a small bit of this bread, the size of an egg, would completely satiate like a full meal. It was a miraculous bread, and the Kohen would eat a small egg-sized portion of it, and it would be filling. The showbread, the table itself always has to have bread, so the breads that were being moved, those were taken off as the new ones were being brought in, so that the table would always have bread on it. The menorah was on the south side, the southwest side of the Kodesh, the sanctified holy area. And then there were curtains. One curtain attached to the north wall, one curtain attached to the south wall. And the Kohen Gadol, the holiest man of Israel, would go into the holiest place on earth on the holiest day of the year, on Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol would bring the incense offering. He would come down to the south side, through the corridor in between, up to the north side, and then come out to the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant sat during the time of the first temple. The Ark of the Covenant was missing. It had been hidden by the kings during the destruction of the first temple. It was hidden below, deep within the caverns underneath the Beis Hamikdash. And the second temple only had the stone, the primordial stone of creation, in that spot. And so during the first temple, the Kohen Gadol would bring the incense and he would put it down between the staves of the ark. And in the second temple, he would just put it there on the stone, on the stone rock floor. Along the walls of this inner chamber were storage chambers, storage compartments for all the tools of the Kohanim and all the necessities of the Kohanim, their clothes, etc. Bob, good to see you. So this was a storage area for the Kohanim. And then there was also a rampart that went up all the way up to the roof of that, so that the roof area could be cleaned and the edges could be kept cleaned as well. Let's see what else we got in our little charts here. This is the picture of the ramp, the altar, the rings, the tables, the pillars. This is an artist's rendition of the rings attached to the floor to harness down the animals. And this is the altar and its ramp. You can see that there's a walking parapet around the side. The ramp goes down to the quarter side and to the half side. And then there were corners of each of this as well, and the sacrifice is brought here. This would be the pillars for hanging the meat. Again, it's just an artist's rendition of the basin, the water basin which they washed with. Interestingly enough, the menorah, as the menorah you see here is not the rounded one. The concept of a rounded menorah is not a Jewish concept, actually. The menorah in the temple, these were straight arms reaching out from the center pile. We know this even from the drawings of Maimonides, that these were straight, not rounded. The idea of the rounded menorah stays, that's actually coming from a non-Jewish source, the Arch of Titus, when the Jews were brought back in the triumphal march of Rome, that they built the Arch of Titus as a part of the structure to come home and welcome the conquering kings. Well, the people who built it had never seen those things in Jerusalem, so they used their own discretion. And a candelabra is a candelabra. They made it round. But the one in the base of English was not rounded, it was straight lines. So we've taken literally almost an hour and a half, over an hour, to kind of walk through the temple mount, and things like that. Again, the intention here is to have a little bit of get a taste of what it is that we're missing and what we will rebuild in the time. And the idea here is that during these 3 weeks of mourning for the destruction of the temple, we think about the temple, we're reminding ourselves of what the temple, how important the temple was. This was our place of connecting with God. It was a place where miraculous things happened all the time. During the first temple, the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies, it took up no space. If you measure you could measure the ark itself, but when you measured from the ark to the wall, there were equal spaces, and the ark itself took up no space in the world. The temple was a place somewhere between time and space, not confined to those restrictions. In fact, we looked at the Temple Mount. Can you imagine when it comes to the holidays for Sukkot and for Pesach and for Shavuos, and they're called the holidays are called regalim. Regalim comes from the word regel, feet. Why? Because we used to go up to the temple. We used to go up to the temple to celebrate with God in the temple. So the idea of going up. it was packed. It was packed. People were like sardines packed into the temple. And yet, when it came time to Aleinu, our prayer, Aleinu l'shabech l'Adon HaKol, and we bow down and prostrate before the King of Kings, what we used to do in the temple is all the way on the floor, spread out. Tummy, chest, forehead, down to the floor. We prostrated ourselves to the King of Kings. Every time it was done in the temple, you were packed like sardines inside, and it came to Aleinu, and somehow there was room. Somehow. So again, it was a place that was beyond time and place. A very holy, special, spectacular place. So I'm hoping that this discussion has been enlightening to some of the architecture, the structure, the spiritual part behind it, some of the stories of the details of the making of it as well. I'm hoping these were enjoyable and inspiring, and that will help you as you consider not only the days leading to Tisha B'Av and a day of mourning, but I tend to think of them also on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, especially Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, we're talking about the service of the Kohen Gadol on the holiest man, the holiest day, and the holiest place, and I can see it. As I read the steps of the Kohen, where he's going, what he's doing, I can see it. And to me, it brings the whole thing much more to life. So I'm hoping that will be helpful for you. I'd like to open up the mic and ask for your thoughts from our session today. What do you take away?
Basically, that this was just a tease.
Again?
This was just a tease.
This was just a tease.
Information that you tried to cram into 1.5 hours. That I hope it stimulates the curiosity to learn a little bit more. And there are some resources available on ArtScroll, by the way.
Yes. Yes.
Some of which I might actually have. I'll have to double check.
ArtScrolls has a lot on it, and Maimonides writes a lot about it. There's a whole section, Beis HaBechir, the house, the chosen house. There's
I think ArtScroll actually has a DVD.
Yes.
Too.
And in fact, at a recent last year's rabbinical conference, Chabad rabbis from around the world, there was actually a virtual reality tour of the temple, and you put on the virtual reality things, and it starts to play the recording that tells you about the temple and slowly walks you through. But as it walks you through, you can be turning around and looking at all the parts of it.
Sounds just like Chabad, enthusiastic adapters of modern technology.
Yeah,
awesome.
I had that. I think I spent at least an hour just basking and walking through the temple in virtual reality. It was just wonderful. Any other thoughts or want to share about what you're walking away with?
I can't get over how complex it is.
Yes.
You wonder how people could put all this together and know what to do when.
Yeah.
You said there's a virtual exhibit of it. I'm curious to know, is there an actual model of it? Because you have the drawings.
Yes. In the King David Hotel, I believe, in Jerusalem, there is a model city outside the hotel. It's a model city of Jerusalem at the time of the Second Temple.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have a second temple there. How accurate it is, I don't know. I wouldn't vouch for that. Rabbi and Mrs. Tauger are mechanichem. They're educators par excellence. And so I recognize a lot of what they're talking about is coming straight from Mishnah and Gemara. So, it's a lot of good detail there. So, and Midrashim, absolutely.
Well, like most things in this class, that's much more than I knew before I sat down this afternoon. So I really enjoyed it. And you may have said this initially, Rabbi, but you mentioned that the design of the first temple was really David's design that Solomon then constructed. Is that right?
Correct.
Was the design of the first temple what was replicated in the second temple, or did the second temple add or subtract?
The second temple was based on the design of the first, and very much followed it.
Yeah, we did, okay.
But the third temple, as described by Yechezkel, by Ezekiel, is very different. It has much of a more of a square design. It's hard to describe.
But the third temple hasn't been built, right?
Correct. It has not been built, and a lot of what Yechezkel is talking about is metaphoric. So it's hard to do that. When we look into the Torah and we hear about the description of the building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the desert, and we're trying to understand how that's supposed to be built, God's describing it. If you've ever played one of these games where you stand back to back and one person talks and the other one has to write, then it doesn't look anything like the other one, right? So at some point there, like the menorah, Moshe just couldn't get it. He just couldn't understand it. And God showed him a menorah of fire. And that's how he could see it. We're having that problem with Yechezkel right now. Yechezkel has given lots of detail to it, but without the proper context and all the extra details, we don't really know what it looks like. But God willing, in sooner than later, we'll actually be able to experience it and go all up together. And how we'll fit. It's amazing to me, the idea how we'll all fit. But again, the temple was beyond time and space. Any other last things you want to share?
Relative to your statement, the temple being unbounded by time and space, when somebody made the comment about the new technology, is the new temple in the future likely to be virtual?
Not virtual, because the mitzvahs, the commandments have to be actually done in practice. You have to have an altar to bring a sacrifice. You have to have a golden altar to bring the incense. It has to be physical.
But they could be done in different places. To be done in different places by different people, everyone brought together virtually. Just as you walk through the temple with the headset on, everybody could walk through the same temple, but just be dispersed throughout the world, or even other worlds at that time.
Right. So there are many areas the Talmud talks about the sanctity of the temple itself, even how, for example, the windows, the stone structure had windows, was all open air. Everything was open air. This usually, if you look at castles, when a castle is built, the walls go narrow so that persons can be inside and shoot arrows or whatever out, but there's very only a narrow slit from the outside to shine in. The lights of the menorah, the gates of the windows of the Beis Hamikdash were reversed. They were reversed as to display that the light of the world begins here and goes out to the world. So the location itself is holy. This is where Abraham brought his sacrifice. It's where he brought Isaac for the sacrifice. It's where Yaakov brought his sacrifices, where Yaakov had his dream with the vision of the ladder. This place is holy, and the temple will be rebuilt on this same place. The design and structure is going to be different. And again, at that point, it'll be by the command of God, because we don't know what we're talking about. But even the tabernacle's construction, you see in Chumash, you read in the Torah itself that God told Moses, bring people of insight to do the weaving of the tapestries. And what does that mean? There were people who had a spark of ingenuity that knew how to do this thing. There were a couple of people who had an overall spark. They knew what everybody's jobs were, but they're individuals. There was some weaving where the weaving had to be done on the living animal. the hair from the goat was being woven on the goat. Don't ask me. But again, people knew how to do some of those things, and it's phenomenal. So very, very special construction. And we'll have that again. We'll have the people who are inspired to know exactly what God's talking about when in Yechezkel.
Is
So to
there
wrap
an-
up,
Is there an idea that since the people who made the original showbread, that family is not in existence anymore, in the third temple, will there be a revival of them?
so we know that at some point there'll be Tchias HaMesim, resurrection of the dead. So at some point they're going to come back. Is that before we start bringing incense sacrifices, or is that after? I don't know the answers there. Will someone else have the inspiration to know how to do it? Much of this stuff, we're just going to know when we see it. We're just going to know it when we see it. And until then, we can conjuncture all we want, but that doesn't actually get a mitzvah done. So theorizing of what could be, I mean, I've heard someone talk about the third base in English already exists. It's up in heaven, and it's going to be brought down. And some guy had vision of laser, a laser construction or something. We can, conjecture all we want till the cows come home, right? It's not actually getting anything done. And our sages have said, don't waste your time. Do not spend your time conjecturing on things that are irrelevant. Let's get mitzvahs done. Let's do another act of kindness. Let's bring it on in reality by doing what we can here and now. So over these next 3 weeks, as we're looking towards Tisha B'Av, that's our opportunity. Find acts of goodness and kindness that we can do to make the world a better place and bring Mashiach down.